Um, Welcome, everyone. We have the pleasure of having two distinguished scholars in our audience. Today, we'd like to welcome you to this presentation. We're going to talk about a new book that just came out in September, The Prisoners of the Empire, a book written by Sarah Kovner. Sorry, I'm just like doing the technical bits at the same time. Sarah is a senior research scholar at Columbia University. She's been a fellow in international security studies at Yale University and an associate professor of history at the University of Florida. This is not Sarah's first book. Her first book, Occupying Power, was a choice of outstanding academic title and won the Best Book Prize of the Southeast Conference Association for Asian Studies. So we're really looking forward to the success of this book as well that just came out in September. She received her AB from Princeton University and her PhD from Columbia. And she also studied at Kyoto University and the University of Tokyo. She lives on the Upper West Side. We also have Jeannie Gersen, also graduate of 91, with us today, who's going to interview Sarah today. She is John Watson Jr. Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She teaches and writes on a wide range of subjects, including constitutional law, criminal law, and procure, family law, sexual assault and harassment, and Title IX. She's been a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Harvard Law School Saxford Award for Teaching Excellence. She's a contributing writer to The New Yorker. So before I hand over to this exciting academic discussion to them, just a housekeeping announcement. Unfortunately, in the past, we have been Zoom bombed. So if there is any such event happens, I'm going to close the event and I'll ask you to use the same link that you came in today to come back to the event. So anything like that happens. Also, Sarah and Jenny would like you to see each other's faces. So please feel free to have your video cameras on, but please mute yourselves. So yes, Christine, you look good. So have your videos on and take your mute yourselves. And then in the end, we're going to have a couple of minutes for questions for Q&A. So feel free to either send us questions ahead of time in the chat or get your questions ready. And then when we get to it, we'll call on you and you can ask your questions. So thank you so much for coming, and over to you, ladies.
Thank you so much. I am Jeannie Gersen, and I'm just really pleased today to be interviewing my high school classmate, Sarah Kovner. Sarah and I took countless classes together at Hunter, and she was really a close friend. It was very, very clear by the time we were in 9th grade, it was very, very clear that Sarah would be writing books like this, that she would be a scholar and an academic. It was much less clear in my case exactly what would happen. And I also want to note that in our countless classes together, some of you are my classmates. Like I see several of you who've joined here from the class of 91. So you might remember that I was extremely shy, not one to speak in class. Sarah was not so shy. And so we made quite a pair and got, helped each other. And so it's really great to be able to do this with Sarah today. And we also see, we have the honor of having Anthony Miserandino with us, our principal. And so thank you all for joining, and let's get right to it. So Sarah, you've written this magnificent book, which I have just so thoroughly enjoyed reading, and it has really opened my eyes to a lot of things about a period of history that I've always been fascinated by, also because of my own family history through that period in Korea, and also like through the Japanese occupation of Korea, and then the interaction between Japan, the rest of Asia, and the United States. So I'm going to start just by inviting you to talk about maybe the thing that we all have in common, which is Hunter, and how you think Hunter shaped your thinking about this matter, about other matters, as a historian, as a scholar.
Thank you, Jeannie, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to Eniko for her introduction of us as well. And thank you all for coming. It's such a delight to be speaking at Hunter virtually and to see so many people that I know. And I am very thankful to the class of 91 for making such a strong showing. Thank you so much. And so, you know, I want to talk a little bit about what Hunter meant to me. And part of that, I think, is also talking about what growing up in New York and the time that we did was like. And I've been thinking about this a lot, you know, even to this evening when I was doing it. I remember the curriculum in history at Hunter as being really strong. I mean, I don't think at the time I was aware of it, but as I teach now, I think I was thinking about it today, watching the return of Martin Guerre in the auditorium on sort of this scratchy film. I don't know if anyone else remembers that, or reading the Treaty of Westphalia, which is not something I spend a lot of time thinking about right now, but or the end of history, which I actually still assign, and just being exposed to this kind of history, I think really influenced me a lot. And that isn't without adding, having colleagues, classmates like Jeannie and so many of you who are here tonight who helped me work through a lot of these ideas. I always think of Hunter as being the place that shaped the way that I think about history and about the world. And I'm so grateful to everybody who teaches at Hunter and those of you who I attended at the same time I did for providing me with that. And the kinds of conversations I would have with Jeannie and others really, and it's true that I talked a lot in class, and I apologize for that now to those of you who had to sit with me in class, but something I think about a lot now. But it's also the place that I started thinking about Japan, which might seem strange because we didn't really learn much about Japan. I know that's changed in the curriculum now. But what was going on then, and I always tell my students about this, is Japan is the time that it seemed like Japan, it seemed like the time that Japan was taking over the world, right? And even though now we look at the world differently, I mean, it's historical in a way, right? That we thought of the world so differently. And when I was in high school, we didn't have I tried to get into the Asian history elective with Dr. Eichler, but it didn't happen. I don't know if any of you else tried to do that, but I mean, they're teaching that now. And, you know, so I started wondering about Japan, which I was reading in the newspaper. Mitsubishi was trying to buy up Rockefeller Center. And so I started wondering about it. And then I got into studying Japan and Japanese in college. And yeah, so that's what I would say about Hunter. And in terms of how specifically it influenced the book, all I can say about that, I guess, is that I remember learning about the Holocaust also through assemblies. I don't know if the rest of you remember that. And that's something I think about a lot now. Because it's still true in New York City, at least with my students, that more people know about the war in Europe than they did about the war in Asia, which wasn't the case at all when the war was being fought in 1945. And that in itself is a history that I spent a lot of time at least teaching about. So thank you, Jeannie, for that question.
Yeah, so yeah, you started to touch on what I was going to get to next, which is just how you got interested in Japan. And that is true that when we were in the 80s, when we were at Hunter, Japan was a very, very different cultural significance than it is today. It really did, it was very high on people's minds as a country that was powerful, that was economically extremely strong, that they were, you know, our primary competitors in many ways. And so can you talk about what got you interested in Japan and how you decided to follow a path toward becoming a scholar of Japan?
Yeah, so I mentioned already that, you know, one of the strange things about studying Japan, or maybe it's not strange, is that Japan is still the world's third largest economy. It was the second until very recently. And that's not something that people think about a lot, even though that was so much on everyone's minds, right? In the, like when we were in school. And, you know, part of it's about how people think about the past and think about the contemporary world and like the narratives that we tell. And anyway, so I had never heard, I didn't know much about it. I didn't read a lot of books, and I always, and maybe this is something I got at Hunter, I want to know about things that I don't know. And so I thought, hey, you know, this is something that I should learn more about. And so when I went to university, I spent, and then Japanese, I don't know how many of you speak Japanese, but it's really difficult. And it was for me at least, and it took me a lot of time to learn. And one of the things about doing that, the more time you, and I was really determined to master it, and the more time I spent doing it, then it turned out that all my classes were on Japan, and I had to be an East Asian Studies major, and I was just determined to understand that. And I think that Hunter really helped me with that intellectual curiosity, and so I'm grateful for that.
So the book is, it sits at the crossroads of a lot of different kinds of fields. So of course you are a historian. It is a history of World War II. It, of course, is a history of Japan and Japanese culture. It is also a history of human rights, being about prisoners of war and their treatment, and helps us with the window into a lot of conversations we have had since then about war and captives in war, and the rights that people have, and the frameworks for thinking about that. So I'd like you to tell us, just as a start, about the book, why you wrote it, what made you want to explore it, what was the prior state of knowledge that you were reacting to or against.
Okay, let me start out by talking about how specifically I got interested in this topic. As Eniko pointed out in the introduction, my first book is about sex workers in occupied Japan. I maybe should have mentioned that, but that's what it's about. And so that is like a first book. It's a monograph. It's where I was trying to prove very specific knowledge of a very specific thing in Japanese history. And this book, but when I was doing the research for that book, I was in the archives for the ICRC, which are in Geneva. And I kept on reading all of these prison camp reports, because the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, one of its representatives' duties was writing reports about prisoner of war camps, and they had all of these duties in terms of providing information to families of people who were held captive. And and there's a lot more that they did, but for me, this was, I obviously knew about World War II, and I knew about prisoners of war. I'd heard a lot about it, but this is the first time that it had come through in my own academic work. And that's like really kind of a strange thing, because when we hear about World War II in the US, and I don't know if we have any fans of war movies here, I often encounter them in my classes, but there are most in the United States or in Australia or in Great Britain, the military history is one thing that people, I guess in academics or people who read books and watch TV are interested in, right? And so I wanted to take this opportunity to think a little bit more about what that meant from a Japanese history perspective. I liked your question about how you said, where do you fit in, like, what's the story that you're telling and where are you coming from? Because I'm a historian. I was trained, my PhD is in Japanese history, and I'm trained as a historian of Japan. And so this book is meant to talk about, like, what a Japanese historian might say about this. But at the same time, I'm really interested in international history. So I wanted to tell the story of how this was also a story of diplomacy. So that's what I was trying to do. Basically, I'm arguing that what I would say typical knowledge, or the way that this story is often told in the mass media and movies, it is to sort of say that Allied POWs suffered greatly, right? We all know this, and this is absolutely true. But the question that many of us don't know the answer to is, we know they suffered, but we don't know why. And what my book does is it reveals why they were neglected and abused. And it's in this way that it cuts into a Japanese history story, which is just that 3 reasons are specific to the Japanese Empire: a lack of planning, poor training, and bureaucratic incoherence. And I'm saying Japanese Empire, you touched into that a little bit in your introduction about why you might be interested in this, but Japan is an imperial power and has been since the end of the 19th century. And I think that's important to understand when were thinking about what Japan was trying to do in this time.
Yeah, so I'm very interested in this kind of back and forth, because I think one of the things that your book seems to be reacting to is a story about Japan and Japanese people that kind of got told right after the war and then stayed for several decades, that as Americans, they were the enemy, right? So how after a war that you win, do you see the enemy, right? And that's of course a story that we're still telling about the wars that we've been engaged in our lifetimes. And so as the enemy, the meaning of Japan and of Japanese people as experienced in the United States, of course, fed into and grew out of how we thought about the war and Japan's behavior or conduct toward allied forces, including our POWs. So what was that vision of Japanese culture? What do you think your book sheds light on about that previous picture?
Yeah, okay, so that is also a good question. So there's a very famous book called War Without Mercy that John Dower wrote, and I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read it, but it's about the different ways that it's how the Japanese saw Americans and how the Americans saw the Japanese, and how there's propaganda and racism on all sides. One thing that I'm trying to do in my book is because when I say, I'm talking about allied troops, right? So this is Americans and Australians and British and Canadians and some Indians and lots of kinds of people. And but the view that many of these people, the first thing to understand, I think this is not something I don't know, I still find it a little bit hard to understand, is that in 1941 or 1945, Japan was really far from the United States. So I mean, obviously, it's still the same distance away, but you can get on a plane and be there in 13 hours from New York. But it took much, much longer to get there physically, for information to transmit. There are far fewer people who spoke Japanese who knew anything about Japan. And that is one thing that I think explains how the United States dealt with Japan, and much of our own history, American history, having to do with things like Japanese internees and things like that. But in terms of how Americans viewed the Japanese, I mean, they're like, and John Dower talks about this, they were animals, they were monkeys, all sorts of like these really, to us right now, and I think even then, it was really racist. They show the enemy as members of an inferior race, not another species. And on the ground, these people couldn't even communicate with each other because some of them could, but in the main, most Japanese guards couldn't speak English and most Americans couldn't speak Japanese. And many, many cultural misunderstandings happened because of this.
Yeah, and so there was this picture, so I grew up both in Korea in my first 6 years of life, and then in a Korean American community in the United States. And then of course I am an American and see the world from that vantage point. And the picture of Japanese cruelty that we got out of our World War II experience, the idea that this was like a uniquely cruel experience for American troops to have experienced during the war in Japan, that it was in some ways worse because Japanese culture somehow uniquely had this built in, that it would be kind of evil in their treatment of other fellow human beings. And I'm just interested in this because over time, we always have some culture or set of people that somehow seems to take that spot where we think of this culture as not having the same kind of respect for human values that we Americans have. And we've seen that again and again. And it's now today, it's not Japanese, but it's other groups of people that of course, after September 11th, we had a whole period where there was a lot in the War on Terror about depicting Muslims and people from the Arab world in a certain way. And so this is what's going on. I think what you're doing in your book is grappling with that particular idea. You know, of course, with Germany, there was that we had, of course, dealt with, that you mentioned the Holocaust and the education that we received about the Holocaust at Hunter. And so, of course, there were always questions about, what about those Germans? What was it about those Germans that made it possible for that to happen, for the Holocaust to occur? And what was the role of not just Hitler, but other people around him and maybe below him and maybe even the ordinary German? So do you see this as part of that project, the dialogue about different cultures? And is there something we can in fact say about Japanese culture and the way that it played a role in this? Or is part of your message that it's not really something you can generalize about in such a simple way?
Yeah, I mean, my answer would be that it is not something you can generalize about in such a simple way. I think that so just to give people something to grab hold of, there's this idea, and I still see it today, about Bushido, the way of the warrior, right? This idea that the Japanese, and the translation of those words, do means way, maybe judo, aikido, those are words that we might be more familiar with, and it's the way of the warrior. And this has been understood pretty widely as this idea that the Japanese were a warrior race, right? And that's not something but in fact, if you read more into it, read the research on it, it shows that this itself is a constructed idea of Bushido, and it's something that the Japanese military used as a way to get to educate their soldiers, to make their soldiers fight more fiercely. And as a historian, the two main ways that I push back against a culturalist explanation in my particular story is that the treatment of POWs by the Japanese changed over time. It's hard to think about when you think about World War II, but at the beginning of the 20th century, the Japanese were famous for how they treated prisoners of war. During the Russo-Japanese War, which goes from 1904 to 1905, and we know about this because observers from around the world came and wrote about it. The Japanese gave their Russian prisoners servants. They took them to hot springs. They gave them lots of food, and they even taught them how to read, right, in English. And so it can't be something Japanese if it changes over time like that. And specifically in the case of World War II, right, this period that I did my research on, if you look even a little bit more closely at the different camps in different places, one finds that there are very different kinds of situations, right? So in Korea, the camps in what's now Seoul and Incheon, these are places where prisoners' lives were a lot easier than people who were held captive in the Philippines. And so I would say then that it cannot be that the Japanese are uniquely evil because they're not treating all their captives in the same way. Beyond that, again, I've at least heard, and I'm familiar with this idea that the Japanese were uniquely, that this was the worst place to be a captive. It wasn't, right? And I'm sure many of you know this, to be a prisoner on the Eastern Front was much worse. And the worst place of all was to be in Russia as a German prisoner in the Eastern Front.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's this kind of interesting shift that in the book where you realize that you're taking ideas about evil or cruelty, which have a kind of intention-based and malice-based meaning, that people are inflicting cruelty on other human beings, versus a narrative, I think, that comes across in your book in a lot of detail, with a lot of texture, about bureaucracy and administration and management and kind of incoherent policy and almost inattention, as opposed to intent to harm. And so can you talk about that? Can you talk about that contrast?
Yeah, I think that is maybe the main message of my book. I cannot speak with authority about other places and other times, but it was overwhelmingly clear to me as I researched these archives that I found very little evidence. I didn't find any evidence of a Japanese plan to mistreat captives, not an intention. I mean, individuals are different and they change over time and change over places. So, and of course, we know that people suffered terribly, right? But what is so difficult for me in thinking about it still is that many of the outcomes that people experience are because of bureaucracy, right? So in thinking about the German case, so that these countries, Japan, Germany, and places that are members of the International Committee for the Red Cross signed treaties in which they were required to do a number of things and to report to the ICRC how they're treating prisoners. In Japan, the agency that is responsible for this is the Prisoner of War Information Bureau and the Prisoner of War Management Bureau. And if we look at the equivalent agency in Germany, there's a very clear line of command that goes up to the top. And so it's clear who is responsible for doing what for prisoners of war. But in the Japanese administrative charts, which the Allies tried to recreate after the war, I found so many examples of it because they were just trying to figure out what was going on, who was responsible, who was taking responsibility for the things that happened. It was unclear. The people who were supposedly responsible, this Prisoner of War Information Bureau, had no power at all within the administrative bureaucracy. They had very few people. One of their jobs was to chart who was being held where, and they couldn't manage that. That's one example of bureaucratic incoherence. Another is, and this is famously a reason why the Japanese lost the war, is poor logistics. The Japanese couldn't get the right supplies to the right place. And that resulted in awful outcomes, people starving and the like. And another thing to think about in terms of the range of captivity experiences is that people who are held captive in Japan and in Korea and in Taiwan were treated very differently than people who were held captive in, say, the Philippines or other places, because they were the organization that was managing them was different. And that what happened on the ground, because everything was so disorganized, prisoners' lives were held second to military strategy. So if the army commander for an area in Manchuria was consumed with a battle and needed to get the weapons to a place, then that took precedence over the supplies that would be going to individual captives.
So I think that's totally fascinating, and I know better than to ask a historian to be as presentist as I am, but I'm going to do it anyway. and I just want to talk about, I'll just say, like today, for example, there are a lot of policies emanating from Washington, and things like people being detained at the border, family separation as a policy, and things that happen where we have the same kind of debate about, is there some coordinated evil policy to do this terrible thing? Is this really more a function of incoherence or neglect or some kind of bureaucratic mismatch between what's happening and what is intended? Is it about inattention and kind of turning away from really facing problems? The pandemic is another example. There are many examples where I think the American public has had to grapple with, what is this kind of back and forth, almost a split screen between what do we think is the intentionality and the actual formulation of policy about these things that some people, many people, consider to be extremely disturbing, problematic, even evil. And then, is this a matter of incompetence, of mismanagement, incoherence? And I suspect that for many episodes in history where things have happened, you're going to find some amount of both of those things or in dialogue with each other. And I guess I would like to invite you to speak about maybe some of these contemporary circumstances and how we're supposed to think about that. And if there's anything that writing this book and researching this book and the discoveries that you made that gave you some tools for thinking about our contemporary situation.
So that's a great question. Just in terms of historical episodes, the Gulag in Siberia is another place that this question gets asked about. I mean, there's an argument that's made a lot by contemporary Russian historians. I'm told, I haven't read the Russian debate, but that is the same kind of question. Was this an intentional thing, or was this just a disaster on the ground because of bureaucratic incoherence? As a historian, at least as a historian of the time that I study, I like to think that we have a more complete documentary record, and it's easier for me to assess what goes on in a specific historical episode. But you can never know everything, and at least in the stuff that I study, you can't. I mean, it's a small percentage of archival documents that we have to go. I guess I agree. I think the way that I'm going to take your question, at least, is to say that there's always incoherence, right? And as a historian, I'm imposing my own narrative on the past, and I'm conscious of doing that. When I look at the present, it's hard to know what's going on. I think that at least to me, it is quite clear that what is going on right now on the border in all of these instances is intentional. I couldn't back that up. I'm sure there's not archival policy documents and statements that back that up, but I don't know. I haven't researched it. I've only read a lot in the newspaper and followed people. I think that, I guess I would say that there are examples, right, of things that were intentional, like quite clear, and there are examples of disorganization. And when I went into this research, I expected to find an order this is how we're going to treat POWs and institutional backup. And I didn't find that. It doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means that none of the people who read about it before I did found it, and I didn't either. And none of the kind of secondary, so the contemporary, not just the military history, right? Not just what the Army ministry and the Navy ministry, all those people were saying, but other observers also didn't find it. But that just, I guess, for me, is a way of thinking about it. I think it's a hard question. I don't really have an answer for you. It's something I think about a lot, though. It's just one more thing on POW camps, right? So you know this, I expect, but there are laws that govern the way that prisoners of war, international law, which is its own thing, but that govern the way prisoners of war are supposed to be held. I guess that's a similarity with what's going on at the border, I suppose, international treaties. But I mean, and also just because I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, there's so much there that I want to react to. And I will say we're now at 6:35. We're going to end at 7 o'clock. And so I think this is the time where I'm going to keep interviewing Sarah, but if any of you do have questions, please send them to me either in the chat or raise your hand using the raise hand function. Either way, so you can have me ask the question, or you could ask it yourself by raising your hand. So I will continue to interview Sarah, and if I see any other people who want to jump in, I will get to you when at the next break. So I'm now going to do yet another thing that I know historians don't like to be asked, which is to turn to a specifically moral register, because of this difference you are emphasizing between intent, like an intentional policy or an organized policy to do something, versus incoherence and kind of mismanagement that can have those same consequences or better or worse, right? So is part of the message of the book in some way that, even if you don't say so explicitly, like, are we supposed to take away that morally, that while we know that POWs in Japan or under Japanese captivity did suffer greatly, does it change the moral meaning of how we think about that? Because how important is it to you, not just as a historian who wants to tell the truth about what happened, but as an interpreter who inevitably is going to be in dialogue with a kind of moral conversation that's been going on since World War II about the treatment of POWs and about prisoners and about war and human rights. So what is the valence, like what is the moral valence of this emphasis for when you urge us to see it differently from the way we've been seeing it?
Well, I guess so my book is written against people saying that all Japanese are bad and all Japanese culture is to blame. I think that takes nothing. I think the kinds of abuses and horrors that I read about, that I detail in my book, those things are wrong. I mean, to me, right? I would find it, I'm sure I don't agree with anyone who says that they are not. And there are several examples on an individual level of acts that were really horrifying to me. And so I guess I would say it doesn't really, for me, change. It depends whose side you're taking and how you're examining the morality. And I think, so there's been work that investigates this. I was talking to you about it before, and maybe some of you have read it. Like there's a book called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning that talks about how does it happen? And he looked at this particular police battalion. How does it happen that normal people ended up committing these horrific acts? And he talks a lot about group dynamics and this kind of thing. But when we think about, so for me as an observer, as a historian, I have my view for people who prosecute these things, right? And maybe this is what you're thinking of. There are laws. If you are a soldier, this came out after World War. Part of the problem with this period I study is the law changes in the war crimes trials. But in terms of how we feel, how you feel if you are a prisoner of war or the survivor of one of a prisoner of war in your family, I wouldn't think that would change what you think of as the morality. But according to how they are held guilty or not guilty by the war crimes trials, a lot of that happens in terms of the people, the way that they thought about it in Tokyo, in the Tokyo war crimes trials at least, was there are three kinds of war crimes trials. There's the class A, which were for conspiracy and sort of these big crimes. And then there are BC trials, which are the trials that are small. I mean, they weren't really small crimes, but people who didn't plan things, who just engaged in evil acts. And those people are treated differently and punished differently. So I guess I'd separate that into the person who commits the evil act, the criminal act. I guess by saying it's criminal, I'm already saying how I feel about it, but an act that is against the law, and versus the person who plans it. I think that those are really different kinds of ideas. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'd love to delve into that a little bit more, because I am a lawyer, and you've now mentioned law, and it is exactly, you're right, exactly, that to a lawyer it can make all the difference whether someone did something intentionally or if they did it because they were negligent. It doesn't mean that if you're negligent, that means you get off scot-free and you're totally innocent. Yeah. But these things make a big difference. You know, it can mean the difference between life in prison and, not life in prison, maybe just a shorter period of time, or not guilty at all. So that kind of thing, that sensitivity to the mental state of the actors, from the top to the bottom, is what your work is drawing attention to. And it for me, it reminds me of the conversations we were having, after the September 11th war on terror, or during the war on terror, and the revelations about torture that our American officials had engaged in, and then all the different levels, like the people on the ground versus the people in Washington. Were they formulating policy? And we had the same, I think, a very analogous conversation about, was this a few bad apples who happened to do these things? Was it something that was formulated as a strategy to engage in practices like waterboarding? And then, of course, we can't forget those very stark pictures that we saw at Abu Ghraib. And I don't think that conversation in American society has been resolved about what exactly happened. I don't think that we have a clear story about what this was about, especially along the dimensions that you're talking about, the bureaucratic and the mismanagement versus the intentional plan to harm another. So I guess my question about that is, when we have these debates, I think the last paragraph of your book actually refers to our debates about torture and military tribunals, which, as the adults that we are, like, these are like these are the debates of our time, as adults, as thinking adults about our society. This is something that's very central to when we came of age, how we were thinking. And so does it help us understand how those events occurred? When we look at how you're telling the story of how these things occurred, the way they unfolded in Japan during World War II, does it help us to understand what we're supposed to get out of even these very contemporary things? They're now history. They've happened long enough ago that I now consider it history. It's not like unfolding in real time, like things having to do with the Trump administration. So they're history. So so now this is now not the first draft or the second draft. Maybe we're up to the third draft of history when we think about things that we lived through as adults, as younger adults. So how do you think about all that?
So the first thing I'd say is that the law under which the US, my understanding, my historical understanding of how this works is international law about captivity was shaped in large part, or at least influenced by the experience that Allied POWs had, right? The Geneva Conventions, which are something that was certainly talked about, more than talked about. They came, some of the people who were negotiating the Geneva Conventions on the ground in 1949 were former Allied POWs. Waterboarding is something that the Japanese did, right, during World War II. So there are those like historical points, but I think so I actually, this semester I'm teaching a class on war and captivity, and I always get JAGs in my class. They're in for, they're in the military, they're lawyers, and they come back for an LLM. And I have, every year I've taught this class, I've had them, and many of them were on, they're on the ground. It was a while ago, but they're wrestling with some of these issues of captivity, and that's why they tell me they take my class. So hopefully I provide them with some answers. I'm never sure if I do, but I think it does in some ways, and this is one of the points you've made. I think it helps us, by looking at the past. Sometimes it's not what we ourselves are implicated in, right? And so we can think, as we look at this example, some of the ideas come through, right? Like to what extent, and you've hit on this a couple of times, is it incompetence? What extent is it individual responsibility? And my hope would be that when it's not something that you yourself are implicated in, that you could draw some sort of understanding from it as an observer. It has helped me personally. It's one of the reasons I didn't mention this when I was starting, but it was in the news a lot when I started this research for the book. I'm a historian, so it takes us forever to write archival books, but it was something people were talking about a lot at the time, and I didn't feel like I really understood unlawful combatant and all of these terms that were floating around in the Geneva Conventions and what it meant. And it helped me understand it. There's understanding, and then there are all these big questions that you're raising of responsibility. And, sometimes we don't always get the same answers, like what's wrong, what strikes us, me as an observer, Sarah Kovner as a person, as being morally wrong, and then what the law finds, which are different things, and how as an American can I react to what I think is, which things that are, to me, just really morally wrong, and where does the United States get these ideas, and how can they be making these arguments? I should say the Bush administration, but who's making these laws? Where do they get the ideas? How can they make these arguments? And it turns out that World War II was a place that some of these arguments started.
So this is actually a wonderful segue into a question that we have from Danielle Simonelli. And the question is there evidence that Japanese treatment of American POWs was influenced by how Japanese Americans were interned in the United States? And I would add to that, which way is the influence potentially going? How much were they even aware of each of those things as they were happening on each side?
So this was a great surprise to me when I started researching in the National Archives in Maryland. I came across a set of diplomatic cables that go between Tokyo and Washington. And so, I guess I maybe thought they were communicating with each other, but they were Tokyo and Washington were accusing each other of not holding to the law. and they were negotiating with each other in order to get certain outcomes that they wanted. But the problem that Tokyo and Washington faced is that Japan was very concerned about its treatment of internees, many of whom, the Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals who were held in internment camps, mostly on the West Coast. And they didn't care very much about their own POWs who were held captive. There were a couple of, there were two, I think, camps, American camps in which Japanese POWs were held. And according to the law, there's no, it's only POWs who could be exchanged with POWs. So Tokyo cared about their internees, and then Washington didn't care about American internees, the civilians who were just happened to be in Tokyo or happened to be wherever they were in East Asia, and was not interested in negotiating for their return. So there was, it was not the same group of people. But one thing but they cared so deeply about the treatment of POWs that, and this is an answer to the question, so that they knew that there's a Japanese American who was shot for trying to escape. They knew this, and they said, you know, and Tokyo said, this is outrageous, and you're complaining about how but we can't be expected to improve our treatment if you don't improve this. I think that it is an open question. I've heard there are a number of different interpretations how seriously we should take these diplomatic cables. If this was just an excuse by the diplomats and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who are, you know, clever at, they could all speak English or French, and which is a diplomatic language, and speak in the way that they wanted. I mean, I think it was influential. It would be hard for me to prove that in any way. But it was very interesting for me to read these documents. And in fact, the next project that I'm thinking about doing is talking about the internment camps in the US and how that looks from Japanese history.
Great. So we have a question from a classmate, Trissy Walliser. Could Sarah talk a little bit about how World War II history is currently taught in Japan, as well as how the teaching of this history may have changed or evolved over the past 75 years? This very much, I think, dovetails with something I've been wondering about, which is the coming to terms with history, coming to terms with the war. You know, all countries have their ways of coming to terms. Japan has been accused of not coming to terms, at least fully, with the war, whereas Germany is often cited as an example of a culture and a country that really did do a lot to consciously come to terms. So what do you think about all that? And what do you think about Japanese people today in Japan and the history of particularly POW camps, in addition to the broader history of World War II?
This is a great question. I like how it's framed. They're like really two different kinds of questions, right? How is it taught? How do teachers teach it? And then how do Japanese understand it, especially on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II? Okay, so in Japan, history textbooks are centralized, which we don't have here in the US. So that means that every 10 years when the history textbooks are revised, it has to go through a national body. And every 10 years when this happens, Japanese conservatives, so right now they don't mention very much about, there's one that does and many others that don't mention much about many things about crimes that Japan committed. But conservatives in Japan say, oh, you know, this happened in a very different way, and one that doesn't really accord with the archival evidence or the beliefs of anyone who is not a Japanese conservative, like really right-wing conservative. Examples of these issues are the military comfort women, Nanjing incident, Nanjing massacre, the guards and POWs. They're not a group that's often cited, but they certainly consider themselves to be one. And there are other examples, but those are the ones that come up frequently. I think in some ways it's a political issue in Japan, but when you come out, there's what's written about in the textbook, and then there's what happens in the classroom. And most high school teachers in Japan are communists, actually. They're the biggest member of the biggest political party. They're unionized, and many of them are members of the JCP, the Japan Communist Party. And so it may not, it's hard for me, or at least what I've been told and what I understand is what's happening in the classroom is different than what is written about in the textbook. And we know this, we all, went to Hunter or friends who do it. What the part of being a student of history is you see what's written and then you talk about it. So I would say that the history textbooks say one thing, how people understand the past is different. And this is something that has also changed over time. So in terms of how people think about POWs in Japan right now, it's just because the first thing I'd say is they don't think about, it's not, well, I would say that if you are somebody who likes military history and are interested in World War II, in the US, POWs make up a big part of that story. And you know, an even bigger part in Britain or in Australia. More Australians were taken captive than died in war. So it's a really big part of the Australian story and of the British story. But in Japan, they don't really talk about it very much because it's not the kind of story that people like to tell about war. It's not a victorious story. It's not a story that Japan came out looking very good in. And there are a couple of examples of it, but not very many. There are also groups that try and bring former POWs to Japan and so that they can see where they were held. And local research, there's a lot of local history in Japan, so people try and, citizens try and understand what happened in the place that they are from and share that information. And that is something that is enormously helpful to historians like me, but it's like a I don't know, it's a hobby that people have. In terms of Japan, these are like kind of the hotspots for Japan historians. So I'm just talking about them a lot, but in terms of the past 75 years, you know, I don't know, Japan, the Japanese government argues for many of those issues it signed treaties and it shouldn't have to account for some of the acts that it did. I think that the way we think about the past is ever changing. And I think that Japanese people and the Japanese government and certainly the people who are in charge of approving textbooks have a lot of work to be done. But history is a place that we see nationalism a lot. So the Korean government the South Korean government, the ROK has its agenda that it wants to push, and Tokyo has its agenda, and these things also. History is a flashpoint for nationalist ideas. I hope that answers your question.
And it certainly is today as well, as we're having these debates about how we've come to terms with our Civil War history and slavery and monuments, and is it about history and accepting history or denying history, or et cetera, et cetera. And that's a very live conversation that I think is very, very present for us. I know that you did a lot of work. It's very evident from reading the book that this wasn't about like just flipping through some other people's accounts. It was, you know, a really hard slog in a lot of places where finally you're getting to talk about these ideas, but there were many, many hours spent where you weren't talking to anyone because you had to be sitting there basically just with your seat on the chair and going through it. Can you talk a little bit, give us a little bit of a flavor for that archival work?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the way that we use digital cameras has dramatically changed the way that historians work. It's been a great innovation for those of us who have families and can go and take pictures, but you can't always take pictures of documents, and then you still have to read the documents when you get home, so you're still sitting in a chair, even if it is a chair in your house. This book took me to many, many places. That is the thing that really stands out in my mind, everywhere from the Australian War Memorial to the Australian National Archives to the ICRC to the Swiss Federal Archives. It took me around the world, and I encountered many, many different kinds of people. I think that the experience that for me is the clearest is the time that I spent in Seoul. A colleague was able to introduce me to, I should say, you asked about what a historian, usually I'm just like taking pictures document after document and then filing them in Evernote and just making sense of it later and trying to take as many pictures as possible in many different places. But in Seoul, I had the opportunity to speak with this non-governmental governmental organization that is really interested in recovering the stories of Korean guards. So Korea is a colony, for those of you who don't know, of Japan from 1910 until the war ends. And so the people who prison guard is a very low ranking occupation in the military. And So who did the Japanese get to be their guards? They got their colonial, the colonial peoples, right? So Koreans and Taiwanese. And so it was really important to me to understand what the experience of these guards was. And I got to meet a former guard, and I got to meet the son of another guard. And I was, there's this organization that's done a lot of work and was able to, one historian was very kind and gave me the colonial newspapers. He had all the colonial newspapers with everything about anything about the POW guards. So that's what I do. I read newspapers, I read diaries, and I'm impressed by people's beautiful handwriting when they're in POW camps. I mean, so I was, and I heard these people's stories, and then I was able to see how I triangulate it with the evidence that I found. And then I went to Tokyo and I spoke with another Korean guard, former Korean guard, who is very active in trying to get reparations from the Japanese government. And he told me what it was like. He's telling me now as opposed to in 1945, obviously, but what his life was like in imprisonment in Sugamo in Tokyo. Yeah, I hope that gives you a flavor of the miles I got and the hours I spent on planes and trains.
And we are all better off for it, because now we have this extremely important and fascinating account. And at the end of the book, I think that we end, with you with a sense of surprise and being unsettled. I think those are the concepts that I think you wanted to leave us with in your final words. And the last sentence of the book is, looking into the past, we find it looking back at us. And I would like to give you the last word, and anything you'd like to say as we end the session.
Again, thank you to everybody for coming. And in terms of looking at the past, I think this really is referring to the issues that you brought up. One of the themes of your conversation: intentionality, understanding why people do things, where does the responsibility lay? And I don't, really have any easy answers, but it's something that I'm constantly thinking about. Like so many people, I read too much news, I watch too much news, but it's something I think about a lot. And, it doesn't necessarily, it's contemporary America, which affects me and us. I think everybody here is living in the US. And I think history can teach us lessons. And so I hope that I've helped you think through some of them. And I thank you, Jeannie, so much for asking such good questions and being generous with your time in doing this interview. And thank you to Hunter.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much for both Jeannie and Sarah for the session. Lovely questions and very interesting answers. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And check out our other events. Thank you so much. I appreciate seeing you all. Bye.
Bye.